Hello and welcome to this lecture on America and her involvement in World War Two. Okay, let's begin with just a little bit of context before we start to look at some of the events and the decision-making process which eventually led to America getting involved in the Second World War. And obviously part of that, a major part of it was not a decision that the United States made, but more of a reaction to the attack on the United States in 1941 when their naval base in Pearl Harbor in Hawaii was attacked by the Japanese. Before we get to all of that, the context I want to think about is obviously the period, the kind of interwar years, 1920s, 30s, and what was going on within the United States during this period. Something you are already familiar with was a time obviously of great prosperity during the 1920s, where the United States didn't really think that it had to have a view or a position on what was going on in the rest of the world. And to be fair, the 1920s was actually quite a peaceful era in world history. And this was a time when the League of Nations believed that it could solve problems around the world, although as we know, the United States is not part of this League of Nations. The United States was reluctant to get involved in European affairs because they felt that the Treaty of Versailles had been a poorly drafted treaty, a poorly drafted document, and that it might lead to future potential conflicts because it treated Germany unfairly. So we know that America is keen to return to a period of isolation post World War One, and during the 1930s, when Europe is very much focused on the rise of fascism, the rise of Nazism, the United States is less focused on these events and issues, because when Hitler comes to power in 1933, when Roosevelt's coming to power in the United States at almost the exact same time, America's problems are not fascism or Nazism, but economic depression, and therefore America can take its eye off of what is going on within Europe, and isolationist ideas continue throughout the 1930s. Although Roosevelt, the president from 1932 right through until the end of World War II, Roosevelt is aware of the threat from Nazi Germany, and this is part of the story we're going to look at today. Why did Roosevelt decide that the United States has to maybe assist and help France and Britain where possible during this period of isolation in America? I should say, just to kind of note that final point at the bottom, America is still very much in favour of economic trading and commercial interests abroad, especially in Asia, where since really the period of the Spanish-American War onwards, there has been a desire for this open door approach in Asia, especially in China, where all European powers and large powers like America and Japan could trade with the Chinese, and there would be no colonialism or imperialism as such. It would be China as a country would be open to business for all. That is something again we have to come back to, because that might upset the Japanese, who might regard China as being part of their sphere of interest in the 1930s. So World War II and the American decision to eventually get involved is a complicated one, and there's a lot of legislation that the American government will pass during the 1930s until eventually they have no choice but to start the war. They will pass legislation in an attempt to keep them out of the war. Eventually, by 1941, they have no choice. So just to summarise, American involvement in World War One, and then also this failed, in their eyes, peace treaty, meant that there was this kind of idea of isolationism in the United States, and the decision to go to war in 1941 is something that the Americans kind of feel that they're forced to do. It'd be interesting to see what would have happened in the United States if Pearl Harbor had not been attacked. Roosevelt's hand would not have been forced. Would American involvement in World War II have been very different? Would the outcome of World War II have been very different? I can say thankfully obviously it wasn't, and America do get involved, and American involvement is again crucial to the success of the Allies, although we should never underplay or underestimate the role of the Soviet Union in World War II. when we look at American involvement in the war and we think about, the Grand Alliance of Churchill and Britain, FDR in America, and Stalin and the Soviet Union, we tend to think about World War II as being this good war, right? In fact, Americans refer to it as the good war. This is the golden era, or the golden generation of American soldiers who were going to war to defeat militarism, fascism, Nazism. There can't be anything wrong, surely, with the motivations for going to war in 1941 in the United States. And the American people buy into this. This is the most popular war in US history, and that might not be hard because the Vietnam War, which follows, is not a popular war. The Korean War, which follows, is not a popular war. The Spanish-American War was popular at the time, but maybe less so in hindsight. The Civil War is a war that had led to great pay amongst Americans themselves. So really, World War II is really up there with the Revolutionary Wars in terms of Revolutionary Wars of the 1780s. In terms of America being proud of what they had done, and 18 million Americans served in World War II. There's 10 million who actively serve overseas. 25 million American citizens buy war bonds. Countless movies have been made about American involvement in World War II. So this was a good war, and it looked like America, which was the home, in the eyes of Americans, of freedom and democracy, that America was going to war to defeat a German totalitarian dictatorship, or an Italian fascist dictatorship, or this kind of militaristic, expansionist, violent Japanese form of dictatorship. So America could do no wrong by eventually getting involved in this war. That's not to say there's not some negative aspects of the war, but we'll keep them until the end. In fact, when you read your Zinn chapter on World War II, which she calls a people's war with a question mark, Zinn highlights a lot of these potential negative aspects of World War II. Maybe one additional positive aspect of it that we could maybe touch on just very briefly before we start to look at events is that you are aware that unemployment rates were still quite high towards the end of the Depression era, and it's World War II that kind of galvanises the American economy, gets people back to work, and significantly reduces unemployment. Okay, let's look at these events that lead up to American involvement in World War II. And I should say we have to think about two theatres of war. The United States are involved in the Atlantic Theatre and the Pacific Theatre. And as you are aware, the Asian aspect of the war is the real kind of reason for American involvement in the first place. If you watch any movies or documentaries on American involvement in World War II, what goes on in Asia and Japan is, if you can believe this, is actually much worse, much more grueling and testing than what actually happens within Europe. We'll touch on that stuff, or you will touch on that stuff when you look at the My City activities. Now, I did say that in America in the 1930s there was this kind of idea of isolation that kind of persisted or had persisted since the end of World War I. And in spite of the American president FDR, who's coming towards the end of his first term by 1935, in spite of FDR being fearful of Nazism, in fact in 1935 FDR makes it very clear, in fact he states in the following quote that I'm going to read out to the American ambassador in Italy, he says, "These are without doubt the most hair-trigger times the world has gone through," and he actually says, even more concerning than the summer of 1914 before World War I. And the reason that FDR says this is because Italy is starting to plan for an invasion of Abyssinia in 1935. And Roosevelt is so concerned about this that he, in 1935, goes to Congress and he says to Congress, "I need to make a request," and the request is, "I need $1.1 billion, just a small amount, for a defence budget," because Roosevelt, maybe for whatever reason, sees what is coming America's way. This defence budget would also play a crucial role in the coming years for America actively getting involved in World War in World War II. So, I should say 1935, with the Italian invasion of Abyssinia, or Ethiopia as it's now known, America and the other European allies did not do anything right. They basically made their views clear diplomatically, right? So they were obviously opposed to the Italian invasion of Abyssinia, but they didn't really do anything else. There was some embargo, some kind of attempts to kind of impede the Italian economy, but it's fairly limited. And then in Spain in 1936 we get the beginnings of the Spanish Civil War, and the Spanish Civil War is really a coup led against a democratically elected leftist government in Spain and by the military, and Britain and France and the United States sit back and say, look, we are going to not intervene in this war. Even though Mussolini intervenes, even though Hitler intervenes, even though eventually Franco will win this war because of foreign intervention by other fascist powers, the Americans sit back. In fact, the Americans who do go, a few thousand Americans do go, they sign up for what's known as the Abraham Lincoln International Brigade. They are mostly communists, but not exclusively, and they go and fight to, ironically, defend Spanish democracy. Well, the greatest democratic nation in the world, America, sits back. In fact, some of these men who went to fight in the war, when they cut in the Spanish Civil War, when they come back, they're referred to by the FBI as premature anti-fascists, which was obviously at that point a negative term, which stated, yeah, you were an anti-fascist too early. You were an anti-fascist when you could kind of promote a leftist cause in Spain, but real anti-fascists, good proper American anti-fascists, they're not anti-fascists until World War II breaks out. So premature anti-fascist was the name given to these men and some women who went out to Spain to try and defend democracy. So the United States is refusing to get involved in foreign affairs, but they're not alone, right? The British and the French are the same. And it's really the pressures of an isolationist Congress that's going to limit what FDR could do during this period. And we get a little sample of just how difficult it was for FDR in America to help the British prepare for maybe this coming war, when acts like the 1935 Neutrality Act or the 1937 Cash and Carry Act were implemented. The Cash and Carry legislation is clearly linked to World War I because America did not want to get a significant loan given to European countries, which had been the case during World War I, which obviously then had a knock-on effect on America's economy, leading to the Depression. So if a country wanted to buy non-military goods from the United States, the 1937 piece of legislation said that's fine, but you had to take your own boats, your own ships to America, pay with cash, and load your ships in America and take them back with you to Britain. That's of no use to the British or the French if war is going to break out. Again, just to get a feeling of the anti-interventionist feelings that existed within the US at this point, in 1938, Louis Ludlow, one of the kind of prominent isolationists in Indiana, puts forward a proposal to the American Congress, where he argues that there should be an amendment to the Constitution that if America wants to declare war, the public have to give it its backing through a referendum. Now, this is actually not that far from being successful, right? 209 to 188 vote against this becoming part of the American Constitution, and you can see in source 1 in your own time, and you can find these sources on the front page of the USA in World War II My City section. When you read this extract, it's quite remarkable, right? That here was an attempt to really remove powers away from the president and to some extent the powers away from Congress by voting for this idea of a nationwide referendum. So if America did want to go to war, let's say with Germany, it would have to be written on a referendum piece of paper. Do you agree that America should go to war with Germany? And the public would vote. It could be very time consuming, it could lose the country crucial time in preparing for a war if this was a process that had been passed. But I think it's important because it tells us that the American people and the American Congress representing the American people are not keen on war at this point, not keen on war in Europe at this point. As you know, right, war breaks out in Europe in September 1939 with Germany's invasion of Poland. Does the position of the United States change once Britain and France, her allies, are at war with Germany and then Italy? Well, the answer to that question is no. The United States policies remain that they should stay neutral. In fact, there's a new Neutrality Act that is passed, but Roosevelt's influence is now starting to shape maybe the public opinion and maybe to some extent the opinion of American politicians. So the new Neutrality Act still was based on a cash and carry system, but what could be done now is that military supplies could be bought. So if Britain and France wanted to make their way to the States, purchase weapons, then they could do so. This was good for big business as well, at a time when America was still, to some extent, involved in trying to overcome her Great Depression. There's a little speech in the second bullet point. You can click on this link in your own time and you will get a little audio clip where you can listen to Roosevelt. And it's a really important speech, because Roosevelt here is announcing that yes, America is going to remain neutral, but she has to defend, or Roosevelt has to defend this idea of helping Britain and France, because he's trying to get the American people to have this global outlook. He's saying, look, if we don't help Britain and France, the problems in Europe, fascism and Nazism, they could spread. If Britain is defeated, if France is defeated, who knows what fate might descend upon the United States in the future. So Roosevelt's trying to very slowly but surely convince the American people that some form of intervention is required to protect America as much as anything else, to protect American democracy. In 1940 there was a survey, a useful survey, good to see, I guess, from a historical perspective, if what Roosevelt was saying was dramatically changing or impacting the American people. Well, although there was sympathy amongst the American people for Britain and France, especially after France had fallen in the summer of 1940, 82% of Americans still favoured non-intervention. So Roosevelt's running for his third potential election victory, and that went against the norm, right? Usually it was just the idea, although it wasn't part of the Constitution at this stage, that you would run for 2 terms and then you would retire, basically. There was nothing to stop Roosevelt, FDR, running for a third ticket, and he does, and this time he does run on a neutrality ticket, but it's a neutrality ticket that says we will make America the arsenal of democracy. America will provide for Europe, for Britain and France, the most important democratic nations. We will provide for them the weapons that they need. Now, Roosevelt does win this election. Does he win it easily? Well, it's fairly convincing, because his opponent, Willkie, the Republican, is also an internationalist. So although Congress is kind of isolationist and the public is still isolationist, Roosevelt and his Republican opponent are both kind of in favour of intervention. So there's nothing really to distinguish between the two men at this crucial point, and foreign policy was more important, and therefore Roosevelt wins. And source 2 is part of his speech that he makes in December 1940, where he tells the American people, after he's been elected, that America will become this arsenal of democracy. And I'm just going to quote, again, you can find this on my site, but I'm just going to quote a little bit from it right now, just to give you an idea of the tone that Roosevelt is using by 1940. He says, the Nazi masters of Germany have made it clear that they intend not only to dominate all life and thought in their own country, but also to enslave the whole of Europe, and then to use the resources of Europe to dominate the rest of the world. So America is being threatened by the threat of or the potential for a Nazi victory. I should say that in 1938 the Stalin Act takes place. This is something we'll talk about when we study, or when you have studied Nazi Germany. And the kind of feeling within America was that, the Stalin Act and the destruction and death of Jews in Germany was was just outrageous. In fact, Roosevelt himself says, how could it be in the 20th century, in a civilized nation in the 20th century, how could it be that Jews could be treated in such a way? So there is sympathy for there is real sympathy for what is going on within Europe, especially for Jews. Although I should say that although the Jewish quota of 1938 was filled, right, 27,370 Jews do come to America in 38, that number is not increased, right? America is still closing its doors to the idea of more Jews coming to America, and obviously some of these Jews are turned away from America, and their fate is not a good one. But again, Roosevelt is kind of hamstrung in terms of what he can and can't do. Just very quickly to go back to this source 2, the arsenal of democracy. Roosevelt, in the second kind of paragraph, you can use, says the Axis powers, that's Germany and Italy, proclaims that there can be no ultimate peace between their philosophy of government, and our philosophy of government. So what FDR is really doing and telling the American people is, look, we're going to help Britain and France because we are the same as them, and we are very different from Germany, and we have to always be ready to act and prepared to get involved in this war, because if Britain and France fail to stem the tide of, and by 1940 France have failed to stem the tide, if they fail to stem the tide of this Nazi blitzkrieg, then where does that leave America? And Britain only just manages to keep the Germans out via the Battle of Britain, and this is a real precarious moment for the United States, and FDR is very much aware of it. If Britain were to be defeated, where would that leave the United States? So as I mentioned briefly, right, the election of 1940 was won fairly easily by Roosevelt. The American people really do have faith in him as a man to bring America through tough times, brought them through the Depression. He will now deal with this possible imminent war that could come America's way. Now, the next thing you can see in front of you is a New York Times front page, and this again shows you just the kind of step-by-step approach that Roosevelt was having to take, again because of the pressure put on him by Congress and by the public not to get involved in this war. As I just mentioned, a little bit like Woodrow Wilson in 1916, he's just ran on a neutrality ticket. So Roosevelt does what he can. He tries to be flexible, he tries to be innovative in his attempts to assist the British. So what we get in September 1940, is a deal done, and you can see the headline here, right? It's very much to the point. Roosevelt trades destroyers for sea bases, tells Congress he acted on own authority, and therefore we're getting this view that Roosevelt is passing executive orders. He's just making decisions that he thinks is going to be the best for the United States, and therefore the best for Britain at this point. So this is not America giving money to Britain. It's not America doing Britain a favour. America's not getting involved in loans. This destroyers for bases deal, which you can read about in source 3 on my city, is a deal, right? I'm not going to read through all of it. You can do that in your own time. But basically the deal was, if Britain gives America some of its old kind of territories, right, colonies that Britain's had for a long time, you can actually see them here. Here is Newfoundland in Canada, and if we go further south to Bermuda, which is actually, as you can see, in line with South Carolina, so very close to the United States. If Britain gives these territories to the United States, so America can use them as naval bases or air force bases, then America will give Britain something back in return. And Britain gives these territories to the United States on 99-year leases, no rent, just you can have these territories for 99 years. What would Britain get back in return? Well, the very final paragraph of source 3 tells us where it says, in consideration of the declarations above quoted, so that's the granting of territories to the United States, the government of the USA will immediately transfer to His Majesty's government 50 United States Navy destroyers. These are old World War I Navy destroyers, but Britain is not ready for this war. Britain is not prepared for the war. She had implemented what was known as a 10-year plan, and the 10-year plan, which had been kind of issued in the 1920s was the view that if Britain doesn't think she'll be at war 10 years from now, then she would limit her military spending and military capabilities. So when war does break out in 1939, although Britain has been aware of it, she is behind in preparing for such an occasion. So here she's just taking whatever she can get and using it, and that is 50 old vessels. Here are some of the territories that America receives in return for this handing over of destroyers. And you can see here that America starts to, acquire lots of territories around the world that she still has today. And as I also mentioned earlier, this is part of an executive order. So Roosevelt has been accused of being dictatorial in his methods at this point. Okay, on to the next slide. 1941. This is the start of 1941 now, where Roosevelt, he's already stated his arsenal of democracy position. He's now saying something different. He's saying not only is America going to assist Britain and France, or Britain at this point, he is going to also make clear that if America did have to get involved in the war, it would be doing so on the noblest of reasons. And he states what are known as the four freedoms in his inauguration speech. And these four freedoms of speech, freedom of worship, want and fear, he basically states are the exact antithesis of the ideas that prevail within totalitarian states, especially within Nazi Germany. And Roosevelt is again trying to prepare the American people for war that would be a noble war. Remember again Wilson in his speech to Congress in 1917, before World War I, or before America intervenes in World War I, and Wilson says something very similar. This is a war for democracy, this is a war for liberty, and Roosevelt is really echoing those kind of traditional democratic foreign policy ideas. And at the very end of source 4, which again is on my city, it says these four freedoms are the very antithesis of the so-called new order of tyranny which the dictators seek to create with the crash of a bomb. So this is really, as I say, an attempt to encourage the American people to realise that if they do go to war, this is what they will be fighting for. Not for money, not for territory, not for imperialism or capitalism, but for freedoms. And you can make of that what you will. There's no reason to think that Roosevelt is not being sincere here. 1941, we start to see more and more assistance given to the British, and that is because Britain's running out of money to buy arms. So we get a new system in place, and this new system is known as Lend Lease Aid. Eventually this money would make its way not just to Britain, but also to the United States, and also to the Soviet Union, who would benefit so much by Lend Lease Aid that they even built a little museum in Moscow. In fact, it's still there, I think, to this day, where you can go and visit the Lend Lease Museum in Moscow, when there was really good, strong relations between the Soviet Union and the United States, because they had this common enemy of Nazi Germany. But the Lend Lease system is pretty straightforward to comprehend. It's basically the kind of end of the cash and carry system. So there would be no cash required, it would now be a loan or a lease of goods. Not so much money, but things that were made in the United States that would benefit Britain during this time of war, as you can see from the little pie chart, and then from this little diagram here, you can see that billions of dollars in the form of aircraft, ammunition, tanks, food, everything makes its way to Britain. Now, how did Roosevelt justify this? He makes a kind of slightly clever little statement where he says, what we have decided to do is to eliminate the dollar sign in our relationships with Britain. And he uses this little analogy. He says, if your neighbour's house was on fire, Roosevelt explained, it would be prudent to lend him an old garden hose to put out the fire before it spread to your house, after which the neighbour will return the hose, or if the hose is damaged, well, replace it. And that was the logic of Lend-Lease. Most of the things that the Americans lend to the British are not going to make their way back, because they're going to be destroyed during war. but this was just a clever way of trying to overcome this problem of the British having limited cash. Okay, we're getting closer and closer to American involvement in the war. In 1941 we have the Atlantic Charter, and this says when Roosevelt meets Churchill on a boat in the Atlantic and they discuss if America does get involved in the war, what the outcome of war would be after fascism has been defeated, right? Which there was no guarantee of that in 1941, obviously. And what was decided was that Britain would have to relinquish its role as a kind of imperial colonial power, that the new world that would come post World War II would be based on self-determination for nations. I know that was stated also in World War One peace discussions. There would be no territorial aggrandizement, meaning that Britain could not say, well, we've won the war, we're going to take this land or that land. Those days were gone, according to Roosevelt. This would be a different world, completely. A better world, ideally, as number 6 says, after the final destruction of Nazi tyranny. So, peace was a big element of the Atlantic Charter, a particular type of peace, not a peace that was purely for the victors. Things don't work out that way because, as you know, Roosevelt, or you might not know, Roosevelt dies right at the end of World War II, and then a new administration comes into power and pushes America in a different direction, but we'll study that in the future when we look at the Cold War. So the Atlantic Charter is, Churchill saying to Roosevelt, please join the war, and Churchill has been told by Roosevelt, okay, but here are the conditions. As 1941 develops, America has more and more ships in the Atlantic to obviously help protect boats that are making their way to Britain with essential goods for the war effort in Britain. And American ships come under attack. In fact, on September 4th, the Greer ship is the first American ship to fire on a German ship because it felt that it was under attack from this German ship. And then in October of 1941, there is actually an attack on an American ship by a German submarine, and this German submarine kills or sinks the boat and kills 128 sailors. Now this is October 41. The Neutrality Acts have all but gone by this point. America is still not involved in the war. Whether or not she would have declared war on Germany, we don't know, but then what happens is events in Japan take over, and this is why America does get involved in war. So war in Asia, right, or in the Pacific, is a result of, as the headline here says, in the Seattle newspaper, 104 died in Hawaii raid, that's Pearl Harbor, two US transport ships that are sunk, and Japan is now at war with the USA, or the USA is now at war with Japan as a result. Now, what goes on within the East, within the Pacific, is maybe a bit more complicated, but that's partly because we have less knowledge of what was going on in this part of the world compared to the causes of the Second World War in Europe, which people are much more familiar with. But we can trace back American involvement in this period as far back as the 1850s, when America goes or sends out a mission to Japan to basically open Japan up for trade, and this is known as the Perry mission, and it goes okay, and America and Japan have quite decent trading relationships. They even have agreements that they've signed from 1911, but all of that comes to an end once the Japanese start to think that they need to expand as a nation. So the kind of Lebensraum imperialist notions that we find out about in Germany, and America's desire to expand overseas as well, all these ideas don't leave the Japanese out. Japan thinks that a very small kind of mountainous nation like herself needs more territory for her ever expanding population. Where's the best place to find that territory? In neighbouring China, and therefore this is why we get the invasion of Manchuria in 1931, where the Japanese believe that they can take some of this territory and use it for the advantage of their own people. It's just that they don't treat the Chinese particularly well. In fact, they bomb Shanghai, they treat the Chinese people in Manchuria in a rather cruel way during this period. America doesn't get involved in the war at this point, right? So there's no desire to get involved for idealistic reasons. In the same way, America didn't get involved in any kind of war because of what was going on in Spain or because of the treatment of the Jews in Europe. Only when America themselves are affected will they possibly get involved in a conflict with Japan. Japan really starts to expand as a kind of imperialist nation in the 30s and 40s. Japan has further incursions into Southeast Asia, French Indochina or Vietnam, Dutch East Indies, British Malaysia, Burma, partly because Japan recognises the benefits of having more land, but also because, like all imperialist nations, there are raw materials to be gained. America is not keen on what is going on. Roosevelt kind of retaliates to some of this kind of Japanese expansion by imposing an embargo on aviation gasoline and scrap metal to Japan. Tokyo, as I said, responds by annexing territories, and obviously one of them is belongs to the French, or did belong to the French, which was Indochina or Vietnam. What we see is that the Japanese are wanting to create their own sphere of interest, in the same way that the British have their empire, in the same way that the Russians or the Soviets have this large land, in the same way that the Germans are thinking about expanding into Eastern Europe, and America has her Monroe Doctrine views that she controls the Western Hemisphere. Japan also wants to control territory. She's an expanding imperialist nation, and she sets up what was known as the Asian Co-Prosperity Sphere. America is not keen on this for obvious reasons, because it would decrease American open door policies and would be a threat to American superiority in the Pacific. So American policy is to freeze Japanese assets and impose an oil embargo. Now this makes life quite difficult for the Japanese, because America has to be friendly-ish to Japan for Japan to be successful in establishing a kind of empire in Asia. So I'm just going to read a little bit from the historian Horowitz, which I've included as source 6 here on your right. And I'm just going to read a little bit about what Horowitz says at this point. It says, adhering to this open door policy, Washington, so the American government, insisted that Japan abandons its pursuit of Indochina and China itself. And once they've done so, America can re-establish full trading relations with Japan. Japan's pursuit of this Asian co-prosperity sphere, in contrast, prevented acceptance of such deprivation of crucial resources. Nor were Japanese leaders willing to leave the Asian mainland under American pressure. So the Japanese, as I said at this point, are quite militaristic and ultra-nationalist, the leadership are, and they are not keen on submitting to the Americans. It says, well, negotiations dragged on, Germany invades the Soviet Union. This kind of alters the Asian balance, because obviously Japan has a border almost, if you like, with the Soviet Union. And Japan now thinks, well, maybe we can attack Siberia and take some of this territory. So Japan and its kind of territorial acquisitions during 1941 makes them a real threat to the United States. And once Roosevelt freezes Japanese assets and bans oil, the Japanese are now faced with a crucial choice. They could either abandon their plans, because you can't expand without oil, so they could abandon their plans for expansion, or they could attempt to seize oil from the British and Dutch colonies. Now, as I said, there was militaristic values and principles within Japan at this point, so the first alternative of backing down is not even considered. The Japanese also realised that Roosevelt and the British would not tolerate an attack on British possessions in Asia, such as Malaysia. So in other words, if the Japanese want to continue, they have to maybe accept their fate. They're going to have to fight the Americans to overcome their predicament. If they can take America out of the war with one kind of sweep, with one strike, then they could have their own way in Asia, and they could do what they want with British territories. So that was the option that the Japanese decided to go for, faced with the alternative of a humiliating surrender in 1941 and an American insistence that they withdraw from China. The Japanese decided to gamble on victory, not just for themselves but also for Germany, and they launched their attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941. These are the islands, obviously, this kind of dark brown area, that areas that Japan started to have control of by the date of Pearl Harbor, December 1941. So this was the coal prosperity sphere that the Japanese were keen on, and they were willing to go into British territories here and Dutch East Indies, which is Indonesia, if need be, to acquire oil. If America were taken out of the war with this attack in Pearl Harbor, then Britain would not have the ally that they were hoping for. And here you see some of the images of what the Japanese were able to do at Pearl Harbor. Was it a successful destruction of the American fleet? Here we can see here, Pearl Harbor. No, it wasn't. The Japanese did not destroy as many American vessels as they should have. They didn't destroy enough of the oil reserves either. So although it seemed like a fairly daring attack and successful in some respects, because Americans did not have any real idea that it was coming their way at this point, they did not do enough to kind of keep the Americans out of the war. And once the Americans were in the war, the Japanese were going to face constant American attack, as you can see with some of the kind of examples of the war in the Pacific that are on this map. So that is really the American decision to get involved in the war. It was based on an attack on themselves. Once the war develops, it does become this noble war, but what happens more so in Asia than in Europe with the United States, it becomes a real horrific war, and the Japanese treat American prisoners of war with great cruelty, and America, the United States, you could argue, punishes the Japanese with the ultimate response, the ultimate attack, which was the dropping of nuclear weapons at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, although some historians argue that that was not an attempt to punish Japan, but an attempt to basically demonstrate to the Soviet Union that America now had these weapons of mass destruction. That is something you will learn about a bit more when you watch a documentary on American involvement in World War II. Okay, quite a lot of information, quite a lot of events, quite a lot of legislation, 2 spheres of war, so quite a lot to absorb. So that's all for now, and there will be some online activities that I'll get in touch with you to kind of have a think about as well. Thank you.